Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
Today, we are honored to be in conversation with Anita Bhatia, an exceptional advocate for gender equality and women's empowerment. Ma'am served as the former Assistant Secretary General of the UN and UN Women's Deputy Executive Director. She has had a distinguished career at the World Bank Group, serving in various senior leadership and management positions, both at the headquarters and in the field. She currently is the founder at the Impact Commons and has a wide range of experience in gender equality, international development, sustainable finance, and organizational transformation. It's a privilege to have you on our show, ma'am. We sincerely thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. So, ma'am, can we start with the questions now, if you allow us?
Of course, sure.
Thank you. So, ma'am, you identify as a feminist who makes her own choices fearlessly. Could you please share a pivotal moment in your journey that solidified your commitment to gender equality and women's empowerment? Could you also share some insights from your distinguished career at World Bank Group and your transition into UN Women?
Yeah, sure. So I'll take those two questions separately. The first, on a pivotal moment, rather than thinking of one moment, I think it was my experience growing up in India, which still has a number of cultural norms and social norms that relegate women to a position which is different from that of men. Although, of course, there's been huge progress made in recent years. But growing up, I just remember feeling a tremendous sense of unfairness about the treatment that I saw that was given to boys and the treatment that was given to girls. And, then in high school, I remember we had a number of really bright girls in high school. But, for them, it was really not having any choice at all, being forced into early marriage right out of high school. And, their potential to contribute to society, to having a fulfilling life, to fulfilling, whatever their own dreams were, you just didn't see that. And so, although, there were lots of opportunities as well for many of the girls, women who were in high school with me, I just remember that throughout my formative years, feeling that the world was a very unfair place in many ways for women, and also feeling very strongly that economic agency was vital for women to be able to stand on their own two feet, and that choice came from having the financial and economic independence to make choices. And, that kind of was a defining principle for me. And that has led to lots of my life choices. Now, you asked a second question about career at the World Bank and IFC and the transition to UN Women. So let me just say that the career at the World Bank was really fulfilling because, the opportunity to contribute to development, to poverty reduction, which is the overall mission of the World Bank, the opportunity to work with amazing people, the opportunity to work across the world and to have a global career, is something I'm very, very grateful for. And I think when I look back at my career at the World Bank, I'm very grateful that I had an opportunity to work in 3 different parts of the World Bank, because I was lucky enough, and there are not many people who get to do this, to work on the public sector side of the World Bank, where the primary client across the table is a government. Then I worked in MIGA, which is the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, working on political risk insurance. And I also worked for a long time in IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector entity within the World Bank Group. And, I think all three experiences were brilliant. But, having done broad sustainable development work for a long time, when the opportunity came to move to the United Nations and to work on a single issue as opposed to different issues in development, and to work on the single issue of gender equality and women's empowerment, I was very motivated to do that because I could see after all of these years in development work broadly that working on gender equality and women's empowerment was really crucial to unlocking other benefits in development. So I transitioned to the UN and, had an amazing run, I think, at UN Women, where we had the opportunity to work on this issue at a time when there is so much global pushback against women's rights. So it felt very relevant, and it also felt so very urgent.
That's actually a very fascinating story you shared, your experience. And that actually brings me to the next question, because your vision for gender equality extends beyond knowledge empowerment. So could you discuss the role of financial independence, body autonomy, and safety in creating a foundation for women's equality and prosperity?
Yeah, so I think women's empowerment, and gender equality, have certain foundational needs. And, in the women's movement, we like to say women need to have rights assured, and they need to have resources assured. And the rights extend from things like control over your own body, the right to decide whether or not and when to have children. That is a very fundamental thing because it is about what I can or cannot do as a woman with my body. So, I do want to underscore the foundational importance of bodily autonomy and reproductive rights for women. But then there is also the issue of resources, which is to say that if a woman has economic choice and a woman has financial independence, she is able to do things that other women cannot. A simple illustration, a lot of women in the world suffer from intimate partner violence, because it is perfectly okay in parts of the world to inflict violence against women and have no consequences for it. Legal frameworks are still not supportive enough of women's rights in many parts of the world. And even in parts of the world where you have supportive legal frameworks, very often women cannot enforce it because of either social inhibitions or just knowing that the legal system is going to take so long that, they are frustrated and they're not going to go through the legal system if they're victims of abuse. But if a woman has financial independence, she can choose to walk out of an abusive relationship and say, I'm going to start a new life. Even then, it's sometimes very difficult because there may be children involved or other constraints. But the fact is that certainly without that economic and financial independence, she's not going anywhere. So, because she's dependent on her partner for, daily life. So I think financial independence is so critical for women. And when we think about how do we change the lives of women, we really have to start by saying we've got to get resources into their own hands. And look, we have seen, whether it is from microfinance or from other experiments in development, that when you put money into women's hands, they manage it very well. They manage it well for themselves, for their families, for their communities, and for their countries. So it's actually a source of growth if if we can achieve it at scale, because they are just, we have examples over and over again of women who, once given some resources, are able to take it and fly.
So, ma'am, as the former Deputy Executive Director of the UN Women, you have set ambitious goals to strengthen the pillars of gender equality and some of the facets you mentioned in the earlier answer as well. Could you share specific strategies or initiatives that you have accomplished at redirecting funding from wars to gender equality and declaring domestic violence as a public health emergency?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I should say, and it's really related to the last question you asked, is that the foundation of women's empowerment is really education. The foundation of equality for girls and women is education. It is the single most important lever for change. You know, when Larry Summers was the chief economist of the World Bank, he did a study, and I don't remember what the paper's called, but I remember this piece having a very profound influence on me. But of course, I've seen it over and over again as well, which is that investments in education are the single most important thing that you can do for development, certainly for South Asia. Okay. But in every part of the world, without education, girls cannot progress. So, in fact, when we were talking about economic empowerment and financial inclusion, I should have said then that getting these resources has there's a pre-existing condition that needs to be fulfilled for women to be empowered, and that is education. So, I cannot stress enough the transformative power of education for girls and women. And this is why it absolutely breaks my heart when I see what is happening in Afghanistan today, and when I see the gender apartheid that is taking place in a place like Afghanistan, in any place in the world where there is conflict or there is war or there is a situation where girls cannot go to school, you know that this society is not going to progress in the same way that others are, because that in fundamental investment in education is so powerful as a lever of change. So in UN Women, I think, look, we worked on a number of issues. And I would say many of the important issues that we worked on are issues that still need to be worked on. I do think there are issues that have been around for a long time that we thought had been taken care of, but then that we have re-emerged as problems. So when I think back at the state of gender equality and women's empowerment, I said a lot when I was at UN Women, and I continue to believe this, that in some ways we are running to stay in place and we are having to relitigate earlier battles. I'll give you a few examples. So if you look at the issue of reproductive rights, now this is not an issue in India, thankfully, but in many parts of the world, including in the United States, something that you could take for granted, which is a woman's right to get an abortion, a woman's right to bodily autonomy, a woman's right, to decide for herself what to do with her body. Those rights have been trampled on and have disappeared in parts of the world. So these are old battles that we're having to refight, not just in the US, in parts of Europe. This right no longer exists because under the guise of family law, lots of conservative regimes are taking away women's right to bodily autonomy. So, I want to emphasize this because it is, again, very foundational for women's, for equality and empowerment. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think, the whole UN system, actually, not just UN Women, and its relationship with the international financial architecture is something that hasn't really been worked out well. And I think, it is very important that the major financing institutions of the world, that development finance, think more about gender equality and women's empowerment. Now, of late, many of the major lending institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions, and many other development finance institutions have come to have gender equality strategies, focus much more on this issue, but it's still not enough. So one of the things that I'm proudest of when I think back to my work in UN Women is actually making that link between gender equality and development finance much stronger. Because what happened during the COVID pandemic was we realized that people were so focused on, naturally and appropriately, on the public health implications of the crisis, but that there was a need to pay attention to the economic fallout of the crisis as well, particularly on women. So at UN Women, we convened for the first time in the history of the organization, finance ministers to discuss how were finance ministers thinking about gender equality and women's empowerment. And, many of the finance ministers were women. And it was very interesting because many of them said, well, thank you so much for convening us, because although we are women, we haven't really spent time. We're so busy thinking about, the usual issues that finance ministers think about. So I think that was very important work. I think creating more attention and knowledge around sustainable finance for women is something that I was very focused on. And we floated the idea, which has been around for a while, but hasn't gotten enough traction in the world, which was the idea of governments and corporates, issuing gender bonds and creating financial instruments that would, address gender equality. Because if you look at the world of finance, one of the ways that the world is working to solve the issue of climate change is through the issuance of green bonds, thematic bonds, which bring attention to and direct resources and financing towards climate change issues. So our idea was, why not do this for gender as well? So we were pushing that agenda, and I hope that UN Women will continue to push that. And I've said, when the world's first sovereign gender bond is issued, please invite me back for that, because we had worked so hard to lay the groundwork for that. So, these are, I could talk a lot about what we did there, but I think these were some of the issues that we pushed for, and I was very happy to see, some success around that at UN Women.
And since you touched actually on sustainable finance and you've worked on that, I want to ask a couple of questions on that. And before we move again to gender financing, as an advocate of sustainable finance, could you explain the concept of impact-centric standards and the role in shaping the landscape of sustainable financing? And how do the standards even contribute to ensure that it aligns with both financial returns and positive social and environmental outcomes?
Well, this is a very fraught area because, in fact, you don't have standards. And the world needs better standards on what constitutes ESG investing broadly, but in particular, what constitutes gender lens investing. Now, there are a number of pioneers who've been working on this for a while, and it is getting better. But there is still a real risk of greenwashing or pinkwashing, where institutions claim to be doing something on climate or gender, but actually are not. So I think we have to be really careful in what we call gender lens investing, or sustainable lens investing broadly. And more, there is a movement towards looking for standards, and there are groups out there like Convergence and the 2X initiative that are working on this. But I just feel that we are not yet at a point where there is global agreement on what those standards are. And that's going to take some time, because that's part of the evolution of the industry and standards. I want to come back to one thing on in this area of sustainable finance, and that is to say, that in general, I think the amount of finance that is going towards women's rights groups, towards the issue of gender equality, is something that the world needs to pay more attention to. Because although it is tracked, and you look at the numbers, for example, if you look at aid budgets, right, from the big donor countries, and you look at how much is going towards gender equality, that number is not very high at all. And that's because, there are so many problems to deal with in the world right now that it's very difficult to have targeted money going towards gender equality and women's empowerment. But that's where you have to make some trade-offs. And then finally, I would say, I think it's really important to recognize that these issues are never going to be solved just by governments. Governments don't have the money. They don't have enough money. And so it is very important, and this is, I would say, a big learning from my time at IFC, to get private sector involved. We need, because the private sector in most parts of the world is the largest creator of jobs and the largest source of employment. Except for, I think, the Arab states region in the world where public sector is still contributing a large part to GDP, it is really the private sector that creates GDP, jobs, employment. So we need the private sector to be really focused on gender equality and women's empowerment, because without that, we're not going to see fundamental change. And that means making things easier for women at work, creating flexible hours, thinking about childcare, pushing on enabling environment, focused on, recruiting, promoting women, ensuring women's representation in the C-suite, in the board, all of these different aspects. The private sector has a huge role to play and really needs to step up.
The field of sustainable finance continues to evolve. What trends or innovations do you foresee in the realm of gender lens investing? How can institutions stay adaptive and responsive to these changes while maintaining their commitment to gender equality?
Look, I think it's, as I was saying previously, I think the private sector has a very big role to play, but of course, so do governments. So when I was at UN Women, we were encouraging governments to think about thematic bond issuances that included gender, to learn from what had been done on green bonds. When you look at where green bonds were 10 years ago, there was no such thing. I mean, there was not a flourishing market in it. Today, that market is very large, and institutional investors, pension funds, and others really want to make sure that they are doing investing that is environmentally and socially responsible. So we were encouraging governments and the private sector to look at learning from the field of green bonds and applying that to gender. But not just that, creating more products and services in their line of business, being more inclusive, private sector companies, depending on which sector they're in, have a huge opportunity to impact the welfare of women by being more inclusive in their supply chains, in their distributor channels, in the kinds of services they provide. We have seen banks step up a lot and create products that target women. But you still have the fact that, and you see this in India, you see this all over the world, that women who are, for example, venture capital money doesn't go easily to women founders or to women entrepreneurs. And then when you look at women who are at the bottom of the pyramid, how do you get assets into the hands of these women? So there is a real need to support, in addition to all of the work that is being done on the formal sector. Let's remember that most women in the world actually live in the informal sector. They are in agribusiness, they are rural, they are poor. And, if therefore, a group like Seva in India, which works at the grassroots level, is so important and needs to be supported, and that model of grassroots work, creating cooperatives, creating collectives, where women can bargain for their rights and make sure that they're being paid fairly. These are fundamentally important things, and this needs to be accompanied by much bigger social security, safety nets, insurance for women, and all of the kind of infrastructure that you need to lift rural women out of poverty as well. So I think when we talk about gender equality, we have to appreciate that there are really stark differences between what urban women who already have certain assets need and rural women, and their starting points are very different. So we can't forget that, and we cannot be speaking only about the urban educated woman, or even the urban. We really need to think more about what are we doing for informal workers and what are we doing for formal workers. That's the way to think about interventions.
I even think so, like at ground level, if we notice, we have so many NGOs in our cities only, and their members are elite women of the same city, and they're the one who are actually taking the decisions and everything for, I guess, themselves, and not considering the rural movement. I think so, and this I've really seen this a lot, that I would call them elite women, but actually we need to put more focus on whom are we making the decisions for it, Max.
I think a really important point to make, and I'm not, I think I want to underscore this, is the need to support women's rights organizations, grassroots organizations, and these organizations, and I come back again to the case of Seva, because I think Seva is a phenomenal organization. And full disclosure, I work now there as an advisor to Seva. So, but I think the reason that I like that model so much is because it recognizes where women are today, or where the women are, and it takes that as their starting point, and seeks to improve their condition based on a deep understanding of their constraints. And this model, which has proven to be very successful over 30 years, is something that I feel, India can export to the rest of the world. We need to take Seva to Africa and show how it can work there, and, create the same kind of grassroots organizations that are having profound and important impact on the lives of women.
Like, so the representation of women in decision-making roles remain alarmingly low. Could you elaborate on how the importance of increasing the number of women in such positions across public and private sectors, the reasons for low representation, and how can we contribute to gender equality, and how can they contribute?
This is such an important point, because, having women at the table, having women in decision-making roles is so important. And, if you look at some indicators of representation, right, you would think that women were doing very well, because there's a lot of conversation about, oh gosh, we have so many women CEOs, we have so many women now in board positions and all. But if you look at the data, and all of this has to be driven by looking at data, not anecdotal evidence. If you look at the data, women's representation still lags. 25 years ago, 27 years ago, actually, when the Beijing platform and, declaration of action took place, and where it was famously said, women's rights are human rights. One of the key things that was discussed at that forum was the need for more representation by and for women. But if you look today, I want to just share some factoids, which I think are absolutely shocking, but people don't often think about this. One is that if you look at the number of parliamentarians in decision-making globally, worldwide, it's still only 25% who are women, okay? So you don't have enough representation of women in lawmaking, making laws that will positively impact women. That's one. when you look at the women who are in as heads of state or heads of government, obviously the numbers change, but out of the 193 member nations in the United Nations, the last time I looked, there were 26 or 27 heads of state or government who were women. Okay, again, extremely low and nowhere near the 50% you would expect, given the distribution of the global population. And number three, if you look, for example, at cabinets and see how many cabinets in the world are gender equal. You would think by now, we are in 2023 after all, not in 1823, or even 1923. You would think by now we would have gender equal cabinets. No, not true. If you look at cabinets worldwide, I think there are about 14 or 17 in the world that have gender equal cabinets. And again, that means, there are many, many countries in the world where cabinet positions are still dominated by women. And then when you look at the composition of the cabinets themselves, many times, the positions that are held by women are the positions that are considered, the softer positions. The Ministry of, maybe health, or maybe the Ministry of, social welfare or social development. But the harder ministries, finance, defense, interior, some of those, you don't really see a lot of women in those positions. So, and then when you come to the private sector and you look at the world's largest companies, who runs them? They're still run by men. If you look at the sector that is really crucial for what is going to happen in the world because of AI, technology companies, they're all run by men. And when you look at the C-suite in most sectors, there are not enough women. We are still at the age where, we are congratulating women for becoming the first woman to run something. Why in 2023? And then when you look at the boards of companies, many countries have laws saying you need 30% quotas for women, that there are quotas for women on the boards. But are those quotas fulfilled? Not at all. Are they enforced? Not at all. And so, there's one thing to have legal framework. It's completely another thing to actually implement it. And when you look at women, its representation in the private sector, it's still a long way from where it should be. Now, why is this important? It's important because it's the right thing to do. I mean, there is a moral reason to do it. It's an issue of fairness. But it's also important because there is plenty of evidence that when you have more diverse decision-making, you actually get better outcomes. You get better outcomes in companies. They have higher profits. They have better decision-making. Christine Lagarde famously said, if it had been Lehman sisters and not Lehman brothers, we may not have had the financial crisis of 2008. So, there is really something to be said about having women in positions of power and at the decision-making table. And this is something that I believe very strongly in and, spoke a lot about when I was at UN Women. And in our new work at the Impact Commons, we will continue to push a great deal for this.
So, ma'am, actually, you're mentioning about gender norms initially, and I wanted to ask you a little bit on that because in spite of keeping or having a lot of women in position of powers, we have seen how gender norms and behaviors play into the society. So you have emphasized that progress towards gender equality requires collective action at all levels. So could you explain some initiatives like he for she and Unstereotype Alliance play a role in changing these unconscious gender norms and behaviors?
Yeah. Look, I think this is a very important and difficult issue because this formation of stereotypes and mindsets happens very early with people. It happens at the nuclear family level. It happens as children form attitudes very early. So they learn things by observation. And so if they grow up in a household where there are very gendered roles, and the women do all the work, say in the kitchen, and the men, are the one going outside, they have that expectation. So it's very important to enlist the support of media companies, and that is what UN Women did through both the Unstereotype Alliance, which was to say it has on formation of stereotypes. And so that work, which I think is very important, was to enlist the support of the world's largest companies and to use the power of their advertising to make sure that you are not stereotyping women and not showing women, as carrying the care burden, for example. So, let's just talk about one thing that became very visible during the pandemic, and that is the care burden that women have. So UN Women's calculations, long before the pandemic, had shown that women carry 3 times the care burden of men, even before the pandemic. During the pandemic, this number just went up exponentially because, suddenly children were at home and women were doing homework with the children, they were doing housework, and their care burdens really exploded. Now, when you think about something like that, how do you make sure that you are getting men to do their fair share of the work? You need a couple of things to happen. First, you do need government intervention. Governments have to pay, for example, not just for maternity leave, but also for paternity leave, and send a very strong signal that they expect men to be taking care of children as well. And in some of the most gender equal countries in the world, for example, many of the Nordic countries, this is a given. Men are expected to take care of children. Men get paternity leave. And in some countries, for example, like Canada, you get leave, which is given to the couple, and the man and the woman can decide how to share it. But in most countries of the world, paternity, leave for taking care of children is given just to women. That needs to change. That is a cultural mindset. That is a stereotype, and that needs to change. So how advertising can help, because in advertising, you can show men doing work that is traditionally women's work, and you can help to create, when you have famous people, because people like to look at famous people and, follow film stars and football stars and all of this. If you show them doing that, it is powerful. He for She is an initiative to get male champions and to say, these male champions, which included, heads of state as well as celebrities, will role model behavior that is important for shifting these stereotypes and mindsets. So I think that is really important work. And at some point, I want to come back to the issue of violence against women, because I think it is really shocking that it still exists at the levels it does. But we can do that separately. So I just wanted to say this about the issue of stereotyping and gender norms, that it's very difficult to shift. I think educational curricula need to be modified. And I feel that one opportunity that UN Women has is to actually work with ministries of education all over the world to influence educational curricula so that it is teaching children in school about human rights, but also the rights of women. It's certainly something I never studied as a student. It's only something you pick up, and it's something that should be explicit and not implicit. And finally, I want to say that it is remarkable how many parts of the world still have the most incredible, outdated, antediluvian, and shocking ideas about, women. I was in Uganda, I think, and I was talking to somebody who said there had been a survey done, and that this survey showed that a large percentage of the survey respondents thought that it was perfectly okay to beat one's wife. Now, this was something, the response was not just by men, it was men and women who thought it was okay. And this included people including pastors and churches who thought it was okay. Now, this is culture, right? This has nothing to do with the church or anything like that. It has to do with the culture of a country or a place. And there are many parts of the world where, it is considered culturally okay to beat women. And so, how do you solve that problem? That is a very deep-rooted, fundamental problem that has to, that is going to take generations and years to solve. But if we don't recognize it as something that needs to be solved, we're not going to be working on it. So I'd like to say more about violence, but maybe we'll leave that for another question.
So, ma'am, in your opinion, what have been the most positive changes achieved so far in the pursuit of sustainable development goals of gender equality, which is SDG 5? And why is gender equality being the docking SDG for the other SDGs? On the flip side, what are the major challenges or obstacles persist?
I mean, look, when you look at the data, the things that have changed over the last 30 years, I would say, are, definitely access to education for girls has improved in many parts of the world, even though it is not as good as it should be, right? Because remember, the baselines for all of this were very low. Certainly, there have been huge strides in women's representation as well, right? Even though, as we just discussed, the numbers are still pretty low, but it is much better than it was. There have been significant improvements in maternal mortality, and a lot of women's health interventions, are much better today than they were before. There have been improvements in things that directly affect the girl child, nutrition, stunting, all of that. There have been improvements in access to education. I mentioned that already, but at different levels. Primary as well as tertiary education. You see now in certain parts of the world that there are more girls than boys in university. There are definitely more girls studying science topics than there were before. So some of those barriers have dropped. In many parts of the world, including in India, there have been huge strides in financial inclusion of women. Many more women have bank accounts today than they did 30 years ago. Many stereotypes against women working in certain industries and the kind of occupational segregation that we used to see in the past has also changed. All that being said, there is still a long, long way to go. And the reason we have a long way to go is because, as I said, some of the issues on which we had made progress, we have lost ground in. And so we have to recover that old ground and refight those old fights. And those old fights include fights over bodily autonomy, reproductive rights, but also in parts of the world like Afghanistan, you have to go back and say, gosh, decades of progress of the Sustainable Development Goals in women in girls' education has just been wiped out because that regime is hell-bent on, absolutely erasing women from that society and just erasing the presence and the contribution of women. So it's a very strange world we are living in, where on the one hand, you see progress, visible progress on certain issues. And on the other, you see what we are calling now gender apartheid in Afghanistan, with such a strong and fundamental rolling back of rights. And a lot of this is connected to, the rise of authoritarian regimes and illiberal democracy in many parts of the world, because illiberal democracy is connected to the suppression of all rights, including women's rights. And more, there is interest in the world today. People want these strong man rulers. And so populations are voting for, authoritarian, illiberal figures who suppress rights and who suppress women's rights. And so, I think it is very important to note that the picture of SDG 5 is extremely mixed. And while there is progress on some parts of SDG 5, there are other parts of SDG 5 that have not changed. The potential of that human capital on the table, So it is really important to have women drive and, be drivers of development. And so I do like the focus that, the Indian Prime Minister has put on women-led development, because I think it is important to have very explicit focus on women's issues from the very top. And it has to be made a policy priority. And the problem is most governments are so busy today dealing with fiscal deficits, the climate change, existential issues, debt problems, liquidity problems. You have so many problems to solve that gender equality somehow is not there. And so what I say is that gender equality and women's empowerment concerns have to be mainstreamed into everything. So if you're talking about climate change and how to solve it, you have to say, how are we doing this with the gender lens? If you're talking about, how to solve for, a macro issue, you have to say, how is this going to impact women? Which is why I'm very happy that, an institution like the IMF now has a gender equality strategy, because I do believe that gender is macro critical, and we need the big institutions, the important institutions in the world, to be making that case over and over again to their constituents, their shareholders, and to their clients. So just, to say that I don't think we are going to achieve, the SDGs, and by 2030 anyway, we are, severely off track for 2030. So we are not reaching the SDGs by 2030, but certainly that progress is going to be a lot harder if we don't start paying much more attention to SDG 5.
Yes, ma'am. That actually brings me to my next question, and I think it's kind of related, because intersectionality is a crucial aspect of gender equality discussions. So how can policies and initiatives be crafted to address the unique challenges faced by women of diverse backgrounds, including those based on race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status, and more?
I mean, look, obviously the way things work, if you are a woman of color, from a marginalized community, trans woman, LGBTQI community, you're going to face multiple forms of discrimination. So you have discrimination based on lack of access to resources, but then you have all these other intersecting discriminatory pressures. So I think, first of all, there has to be a recognition of there is something called that intersectionality matters, and that it matters for the formulation of policy and for the implementation of policy. One thing that I think we haven't talked a lot about, but I want to mention, is that in all of this work, whether it is gender equality or any other aspect of the SDGs, the thing that people don't focus enough on is actually implementation, execution. This is hard stuff, and it is really important to focus on that, because it is one thing to have frameworks in place, laws in place, that is, I mean, it's not always easy to get the right laws passed, etc. But even if you have the legal framework, the big issue in most countries is really implementation and accountability. So I think for any SDG, whether it's SDG 5 or any one of the others, the key focus has got to be on follow through and execution.
Right, ma'am. So, ma'am, there's a concept of the queen bee syndrome, which suggests that some women leaders might not actively support or mentor other women. How can organizations foster an environment where women leaders empower and mentor each other to collectively drive progress?
Well, there's a saying, I think it was Madeleine Albright, who said there's a special place in hell for women who don't support other women. And I do believe that. And by the way, I think it's not very it's not an easy thing to say, nor is it something that people like to say. But the truth is that sometimes women are women's worst enemies. And I think that there's not necessarily much you can do in terms of prescription for this, because how do you tell a woman to be better to other women? But I think it really is role modeling. Role modeling can make a big difference certainly in a private environment where, when you see women who are actively trying to lift up other women, and this matters, and has good positive consequences, then other women might feel inspired to follow on that. But broadly, I don't think it's something that you can legislate.
Lastly, how did the COVID-19 pandemic contribute to bringing domestic violence to the forefront of global awareness? And what strategies or initiatives do you believe are essential in addressing and combating gender-based violence in the light of these challenges?
It is really a blot on humanity that you still have the levels of violence against women that you do, that there is so little recognition at a public policy perspective of the harmful effects of violence, and that I think people that violence needs to move out of being considered a private matter to really a matter of public policy, and that public policy needs to be much bolder about how it takes on violence against women. It's not enough to do preventative work and provide shelters for victims of violence. There needs to be much more discussion about this. One of the silver linings of the pandemic was that there was a discussion about this topic. One of the awful things about the pandemic was that there was an exponential rise in violence against women, but the rise was so visible that government leaders had to speak about violence against women in a way that they had never had to do before. So you saw male prime ministers like Scott Morrison of Australia talking about violence against women, in a country with a very, with a history of and high incidence of violence against women. So, I think this is something that has to be taken on as a big public policy priority. And it is not until we see this discussed at every level of government, from the Prime Minister and the President to in every country as something that has to change, are we really going to see a big change in violence against women. And I think it is really terrible that in 2023, we still have the rates of intimate partner violence and, broadly violence against women and killings against women at the rates we do. This is not just about, there is people still in many parts of the world feel it is perfectly okay to beat women. And this is something that has to be changed. It's not, and I want to see this changed. I'd like to see change in my lifetime, but at least if not in my lifetime, in my daughter's lifetime. because we cannot claim to be a civilized species if we permit this kind of violence. Whether it's again, I mean, violence of all forms is ugly and should be ended, but particularly violence against women and children, I think, is something that we need to take on.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for your insightful perspective on gender equality, sustainable finance, and women's empowerment. Your passion and expertise inspires us to continue striving for a more equitable world. It's been an honor hosting you on our show, and we hope that the wisdom you have shared will resonate with young people and advocates alike. Your fearless advocacy for gender equality is truly commendable. Thank you so much, ma'am.